Okay, you're welcome to begin.
Okay. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, the Lord of all the worlds, to whom we belong, to whom is our return. And may His choicest blessings go to the highest of Allah's creation, our beloved Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who came to humanity as a teacher. He was gentle in speech, he was generous in his demeanor. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I want to welcome all of you from different parts of the world to the launch of this beautiful book, Curriculum Renewal for Islamic Education, Critical Perspectives on Teaching Islam in Primary and Secondary Schools, edited by Nadeem A. Mamin, Maryam Al-Hashmi, and Muhammad Abdullah. I want to begin to just share some of my thoughts and my praise, really, inshallah. The message that I got reading this book and reading it quite closely is that indeed education is a dynamic process, but sadly our curriculum in many parts has been very, very static. And what I like about the book, it is based both on empirical research, it is anecdotal and also experiential. And what it does, I think, when I read the book, I began to reflect on my craft as a teacher, what I should be doing differently. And the insights that are shared by the contributors, I like to believe will leave an indelible impression and perhaps effect change in our classrooms, so that inshallah, that our learners will be empowered with the true meaning of Islam and be eloquent ambassadors for the deen. Having said that, Nadeem, I'll come to you first. Why this book? And why, in terms of the book, also, I'd like you to comment on the title, which I found very, very appropriate.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Brother Idris, thank you sincerely for hosting us and the Association of Muslim Schools in South Africa. Why this book? Why now? I think those of us that have been in the field far longer than I know that curriculum has been a concern for Islamic schools globally for a long time. It's been sort of the pillar that we see as the foundation of what we bring to Islamic schooling. It is the curriculum that we bring, and part of that is to understand what it is that's going to make that curriculum connect with young people, that's going to be contextually relevant, and that's going to transform both ourselves as educators and also the students that we teach. And I think the aspiration of this book was to be a response to all of those educators globally that have been striving to renew their curriculum in their own schools, but feel oftentimes challenged on where to start. And there's been major, I think it's important to acknowledge that this book is standing on the shoulders of giants of people that have been working on curriculum for Islamic schools. And in no way does it replace the efforts that have been put into developing curricula. But what this book offers really is a response to become curriculum architects ourselves in our own schools, to recognize that if we give you a textbook or if we give you a curriculum outline with outcomes, oftentimes that isn't sufficient. Most schools would say, that's not how I would teach it. That's not the angle I would take. This doesn't have the right emphasis on this part of what I would see as important. And oftentimes there's almost pushback to the important curriculum initiatives that are out there. So this book was meant to say, how do we look at what we already have established, all of the important curriculum work that's been done globally? How do we look at that and build on it in a way that we can look at our own schooling context in different parts of the world, including in our own schools individually, and think about developing curriculum teams to be empowered to develop our own internally, which is why we call this curriculum renewal for Islamic education, critical perspectives on teaching Islam in primary and secondary schools, because in every chapter, what we try to do is each of the contributors have tried to take a critical reading, a constructively critical reading of what's out there, to say, here's some of the strengths, here's some of the things that we would like to see being done differently, and here are some ways of thinking about curriculum renewal that schools can start to grapple with.
Yeah, I think, Brother Nadeem, just for those who don't know who Brother Nadeem is a senior lecturer for Islamic thought of education. He's got his PhD, University of South Australia. You make some very, very, I mean, all your points are very, very critical. And what I liked especially, the whole issue about wanting teachers to be curriculum architects. I like that, because sadly, in my own observation in schools throughout the world, many educators do not innovate, create, and make their curriculum dynamic. And that's one. And the second part I would like you to respond to in terms of transforming teachers and transforming the learners in the end. These are going to be our beneficiaries. And I've also noticed that, alhamdulillah, you've got contributors from different parts, Farah Ahmad, whom we know, Abdullah Treverton and others, and of course your good selves. Was there a particular reason to get experiences from other parts of the world in terms of the book? I know it's the three-layered question. I thought I'll just share that with you.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was definitely part of the vision, was to get scholars, people who are scholars of Islamic studies, people who are academics in the field of education and curriculum studies, and then also educators who are in classrooms and who understand the challenges and the aspirations of curriculum renewal. So we wanted to bring together a group of educators, and this wasn't. I think what's special about this book is that this book wasn't a series of chapters that were written in isolation. We started this project probably 3 years ago. We had multiple meetings at the outset of the conceptualization of the book, where we brought these people together virtually, obviously, brought them together multiple times to have a conversation about what's needed, what the aspirations of the book should be, how we should write these chapters. And then we went our own ways once we had a common structure. But I think what's beneficial from this book is that each chapter contributes to a broader area of focus. And I think that's quite special. It's designed almost for schools to take this book for your professional learning community in your school and say, let's put together a curriculum committee. Let's put together a reading group. Let's, as a school-wide, take a chapter a month, read it, think about it, and start to develop our own strategies of how we can implement curriculum change. And I think that's, like I mentioned earlier, we can develop the best curriculum textbook series that we can come up with. And I can almost guarantee that it won't suit everyone's needs. Most schools will respond and say, that's not what we were looking for multiple reasons. And this is why this book, the aspiration of it is to really empower us as educators.
Okay, Nadeem, the book doesn't purport to be like a panacea to all the ills or shortcomings in schools. And I think in the end, to what extent do you think what happens in the school depends largely on the leadership of the school? You're looking at head teachers. And if they are not receptive to new ideas, if they're not receptive to introspection, surely the effort will be thwarted, as it were. So I want you to just focus a bit on leadership for me, which I think is a very, very critical dynamic when it comes to schooling.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good point. Curriculum renewal can be done bottom up or it can be done top down. And ideally, if it's done both ways, that's when you hit the sweet spot. So if you go bottom up, you have teachers who are doing creative things in classrooms, and that can speak volumes for individual classrooms. But if you have a school leader that champions curriculum renewal, then it can be quite special because you have the support from the leadership of the school that is driving educational change and not just administrative change. You know, oftentimes school leaders are focused on the administration of the school and really fighting fires. This approach is to say, let's take the education that we're offering in our school seriously ourselves, and let's think of a framework top down from an educational leadership perspective, and then implementation bottom up within classrooms to think about the creative things each of us can be doing. Because, you know, if you have a teacher who is, we've got a chapter in this book on physical education, you've got a chapter on music, you've got a chapter, you know, chapter on aqidah and fiqh. Depending on what you're teaching, what grade you're teaching, you are the champion of your own classroom space. And as much as we need an overarching framework that would be led by a school leader, we also need we need to provide the opportunities for teachers within individual classrooms to lead that change themselves and to really be innovative on their own.
Jazakumullah for that, Nadeem. I would now direct my question to Muhammad Abdullah. AlhamduLillah, he's got his PhD. He's the director of the Center for Islamic Thought and Education, University of South Australia, Australia. Brother Professor Muhammad Abdullah, my dear brother, in terms of your input into the book, what would you say are some of the takeaways?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu salam ala rasulillah. Thank you very much for hosting us again. I think Dr. Nadeem Memon has articulated those takeaways quite well. For me, I think a key takeaway that permeates the entire book is this idea of renewal. And allow me to just say something about that, because we can sometimes misunderstand by what is meant by renewal. So renewal or tajdeed is quite a fundamental aspect of the Islamic tradition and Islamic history, which tells us that one must not be stuck in the past, but also one must not ignore contemporary present realities. And that aside from the Quran and the hadith of Rasulullah, the sound hadith of Rasulullah, everything else is not absolute. The Quran is absolute and the word of Rasulullah is absolute, and those are not subject to change. They're not subject to manipulation. But everything else within the Islamic tradition, including education, is part and parcel of human endeavor, a human intellectual endeavor. And just like fiqh or jurisprudence, education equally must be examined and re-examined so that, number one, it reflects the fundamental values of Islam, and in this case, the fundamental roots, if you wish, of Islamic education. And that those must never be compromised, regardless of how we shape the curriculum. The fundamental roots of what makes up Islamic education, which is fundamentally premised on an Islamic worldview, those cannot change with time and place. But the what and the content, in other words, and the how do we deliver that should be subject to examination and re-examination again and again and again. One, because the very process of teaching and learning is an amana, it's a trust, and it has to be renewed so that it is reflective of, one, the learner himself or herself, but secondly, the socio-economic, political, educational context where a school is operating or where Muslims are operating. And I think this is crucial for me as a fundamental takeaway of this book, that we must not assume that the curriculum, Islamic Studies curriculum, Islamic education curriculum that we work with today is going to be relevant necessarily 10 years from now. But the fundamental premises or the roots of Islamic education remain the same, but we continue to examine and re-examine in a process known as tajdeed or renewal, so that we continue to be reflective of the needs of the day and certainly the aspirations and requirements of the learner.
Okay, and also what I also liked, if you could just talk a bit about the learner responsive fiqh,
Yes.
and which, and I think this is for me extremely relevant in terms of their perception of fiqh, in terms of how it is presented in the curriculum. I mean, I'll just mention one or two things. Among the things they say, it's boring, tedious, disengaging. And I think that's important,
Yeah, well, the first part of the book is Islamic Studies curriculum, which deals with the Quran, fiqh, aqidah, seerah, and akhlaq. And these seem to be the core elements of what might constitute Islamic education. However, we should extend that and include all the other things that are mentioned in the book, such as how do we teach history, for example. So in terms of fiqh per se, jurisprudence, which is the chapter that I have written on, we use that just as an example because it's practical living. And one thing is to assume, and that's what we have noticed, is to assume that students want to learn certain things. And then we go and teach them those things, but realize that that's not what they wanted to learn. That's not what they were looking for. And so we wanted to find out from the learners themselves, what is it that attracts them to the study of Islam, in this case, jurisprudence of fiqh, which is the science of Sharia, and what is it that they think needs to improve. And what we have found is that overwhelmingly, those students from across multiple schools, at least in Australia, empirically, but also anecdotally from experience, is that they found the way we are teaching Islam, that's number one, the pedagogy, but also the content of what is being delivered at different stages in their lives, schooling life, is not always reflective of their needs and aspirations. It's irrelevant to their lives, it's repetitive, it's boring, and it's biased. So if you take fiqh as an example only, and it's only one example, and I looked at 4 curricula that teaches fiqh, and we found that what the learners told us was actually present in all of these curricula. So what we are saying is the teaching of fiqh, which is so fundamental to the life of a Muslim, whether young or not, is we need to teach it in such a way that one, they feel attached and attracted to it, but secondly, feel that it actually relates to their lives. So for example, why teach a learner who is in grade 6 or 7 the fiqh of ghusl of the mayyit, of the deceased, right? When we could be utilizing that time to teach him the fiqh of other issues that are particularly relevant to them. And then as they grow, we advance that knowledge and build on previous knowledge so that they continue to be attracted to the teaching of fiqh. So that is what we mean by fiqh responsive, learner responsive fiqh. That is fiqh that is taught in a way that is going to be relevant to the lives of those learners, in ways that is going to essentially click with them and make them or help them transform their lives and not see it as a process of transmission of knowledge.
Yes, alhamdulillah. And what I also liked is the fact that, as you mentioned in passing, that you looked at some of the curricula from other parts, like the IQRA, the one in South Africa, and also I Love Islam, learning from textbooks. And what I also liked, in a very gentle way, whilst you recognize some of the positives, you also shared your concerns. And I think for me, one of the underlying messages is this, that no one has a monopoly of knowledge. If we want to grow as a phenomena in terms of schooling, we need to engage with other minds in other parts of the world. I think that was, for me, a very critical aspect. The last question I want to ask you whilst we're at it, right, is the fact that you find that whilst we are speaking about the curriculum, which is very, very significant, right? What about, perhaps it was not your ambit to do it or your remit to do it in this particular book, looking at, perhaps you did it, yeah, of course you did, is about the methodology. How important is the methodology, the presentation of the lesson?
Yeah, well, that's so crucial, because one could have all the content knowledge, but if the delivery is not responsive to the learner, then the concern is that that message may not be delivered or absorbed appropriately. And we are currently working on a paper that looks at educators' perspectives on Islamic studies. And what is important is, if you look at the life of Rasulullah, for example, it's not only what he said, but it's how he said it and how he presented it, that to the learner, that really had the greatest impact on the life of the learner. And I think this is important, and this is where I think Nadeem touched on this. And fundamentally, one of the important aspects of this book is that it argues, and it says to everybody who wants to indulge in enacting or in a construction of a curriculum, Islamic education curriculum, premise your foundation on an Islamic worldview. And if you look from an Islamic worldview on how the Prophet ﷺ, who is the greatest teacher, how he presented, his pedagogy was amicable. His pedagogy was at once compassionate, merciful, dignified, but also just. And he was aware of the learner in his presence, even when the learner in his presence was somebody who has committed the greatest of mistakes. He was able to rectify that with an unbelievable, beautiful, compassionate approach. So content on its own is not sufficient, but also how to deliver, which requires an understanding of what I would call context. And so just as in the issuance of a fatwa, relying on text alone is not sufficient, but text and context must go in hand so that the fatwa or the learning of Islam becomes contextual and relevant, and it helps the learner to actually practice it in their lives.
Jazakumullah for that. Inshallah, I hope that we'll have time for questions. I'm sure there are many people raring to go to ask certain questions, right? Mohammed, Professor, Jazakumullah, always a joy to listen to you, right? So I'm going to call upon Sister Danielle Jabara, who is a visual arts teacher from Irfan College, Sydney, Australia. I would like to engage her now, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Good to see you again.
Likewise. In regards to my contribution to the chapter, Samah and I teamed up and we created lesson plans about concept-based lesson plans in regards to Islamic pedagogy and our special KLAs. Me being a secondary teacher, a visual arts teacher, my focus was on stage 5 lesson plans, which focuses on usually year 9 and year 10 in age group. AlhamduLillah. Would you like me to go through the lesson plan?
Yes, I would like to. But before you go ahead with the lesson plan,
Yes.
right? I think in the introduction, you say, you all say it, as a group, that it strikes at the heart of the issue is the diversity regarding opinions about, music and fine arts and so on and so forth. And it's about how did you go about negotiating that before you put the lesson plans together,
Correct. I think that as teachers and as Samah and I have both taught in the public school sector and in the independent Islamic school sector. And it's a question that we often, as educators, ask ourselves first and foremost, because this KLA within music and visual arts, there are certain beliefs or a lot of content and pedagogy that is taught that can often compromise the Islamic belief system. And it can be quite conflicting for individuals such as myself, as an educator, as an artist, at times to be confronted by things that can be, as mentioned, conflicting to what I believe in. And I think that you go into it with an open mind, inshallah, and with an open heart, and you assess Islamic pedagogy, and then you assess the pedagogy that is KLA related, such as music or visual arts, and then you select what is appropriate to what you believe in, and you try to marry the two together. I hope I answered that right. So please tune in.
You did.
I think it's really important to really assess information, assess content, assess what is relevant, evaluate what is relevant, and then place that into a program that really brings out what is beautiful in our religion and beautiful about the cultured world as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, and now coming back, you could focus now on the curriculum itself. If you can give us an idea.
Yes.
How did you go about doing it?
So, I try to marry a lot of my lesson plans and a lot of my unit programs with Islamic pedagogy and with a strong root in Islamic sciences. I feel that just as a practicing Muslim, it's fundamental. In my own individual practice, I think it starts with your own personal practice as an individual, and then that transcends through your teaching, AlhamduLillah. And the outcome is so beautiful to see when you have students which is a very big shame, students who have an Islamic background but do not know much about the arts, because there is always a black sheet that's covered over the arts, where Islamically, Islam is rich with the arts. Our Islamic history, going into Islamic sciences, Islamic calligraphy, the word of God, it's so rich with knowledge and content that it's a shame that it's not highlighted within our Islamic schools. It's not highlighted as an important aspect in student learning and teaching. And that's what I speak for myself, but coming into lesson plans and creating school units and learning programs, I try to incorporate and shed light on Islamic history and Islamic sciences the best I can. And the way I did that, particularly with the lesson plan that I've outlined in the chapter, is I had a strong focus on still life art. And as any art teacher can know, or anyone who started still life art, it could be very boring and challenging for individuals alone, yet students. So I integrated that with the aspect of Islamic art, design and geometry. And then I needed to intertwine that with Australian historical art and Australian historical studies, along with the aspects of creating technical and developing student technical skill. So I said, okay, I need to connect all three aspects together. And there is an amazing artist. He's an Australian artist by the name of Lucien Henry. And his artwork, The Waratah, is a perfect example of Australian identity, Australian history, Australian representation. And there's a strong intertwine there in regards to the artwork having a turquoise gold Islamic geometric print as a background to the Waratah being in the foreground. So I had the students assess, and we opened up the program with the assessment of Lucien Henry's art practice. His graphic design work towards the turn of the century, the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. We looked at the color codes that he used within his art practice. Then we delved into the significance and the representation and symbolism of still life art. And we assessed the symbolism and the representation of the Waratah in Australian culture. And then we broke down Islamic art and geometry, and we assessed Islamic history and Islamic and art within Islamic history. Sorry, excuse me. And through this, and to keep students motivated, I thought I need to challenge them as best I can practically. So then we focused on lino printing, which is a carving method. So students had to marry a still life drawing with the backdrop of Islamic geometry or an arabesque design. And then they projected this drawing onto a lino plain block, and they had to draw their designs onto the block and carve out negative and positive space of their design on the lino block, print it up, and then create a 4-print edition of this image. Once the print is finished, they then hand colored using watercolor the selected colors that they had chosen for the particular artwork. And I found that I just, at the end of this term, so not even 3 weeks ago, it was the second time I taught this lesson in this unit program, and the outcome is just absolutely astonishing. Kids are involved and immersed in the art making practice, and not only the art making practice, but the critical and historical art study component of the unit as well. And not only does it create awareness in regards to knowing their religion better, but it allows them to be cultured in a way that it allows them to be cultured with guidance, which is very, very important in the arts.
Okay, Sister, Jazakumullah for that. There are 3 things that I want to mention. The one is, Alhamdulillah, you are connecting the art and the presentation to your Islamic belief, and I can see the enthusiasm that you bring to the classroom. Only yesterday, I received a video clip about some of those cathedrals in Europe, and they found that, did you see that?
Yes.
Right? And they found that it all had its roots in Islam, in the Middle East.
Islamic,
right?
yes.
Yeah, you saw that, right? And the last part I mentioned, I must just mention very quickly, is when I was at school, I wasn't quite an artist, so we had this new art teacher wearing a beret like mine, he was like Picasso, feel free to express yourself. So I should just throw in paint and everything else. I drew something of which I could not understand it myself. He said to me, Idris, you know what? It is so beautiful. There's a deep meaning there. So anyway, I laughed it off. Anyway, that's by the way. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you.
Welcome. Right, now I'll go to Sami Zaki, right? Because Alhamdulillah, she is a primary school teacher from Irfan College, of course, a colleague of Daniel, Sydney, Australia, right? So if I could speak to Sami. Okay, wa alaikum salam. Good to have you back.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here.
Sami, in terms of the book, in terms of your area, right? Alhamdulillah, the chapter reads beautifully. There are many, many practical examples. In terms of this, why do you think, for example, there are 2 questions here. Why do you think schools should promote the idea of art and so on and so forth? And secondly, in terms of your own challenges you might have had, how did you deal with it?
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So, look, I think art is something that you cannot neglect, and I think Sister Danielle had articulated herself quite well, mashallah, in regards to the importance of it. And so if we look at ways to connect children and their funds of knowledge, and that's something that Brother Dylan and Dr. Nadim had inspired us with at Irfan, to connect their worldview into the curriculum, then you will get that engagement and that passion. So it is quite vital, and it is a way of balancing all key learning areas, I believe, through the arts. So for example, at this point in time, I am teaching Islamic Studies, and this semester we're looking at purification, tahara, and wudu, ablution. And so I have I've been very fortunate to be able to collaborate with the design and technology teacher and the music teacher. And so she's given us ideas on ways to engage the students with fiqh and engage them through the arts. So a lesson that, or an assignment that students will be taking part in is through her subject, she's teaching musicals, sorry. And then I was thinking about how am I going to get the idea of wudu and purification engaging enough for these students to take part in. And so her suggestion, and it's something that we're going to go ahead with, inshallah, is to get the students to create a musical based on purification and wudu. And we looked at examples such as Zain Bikhat, the artist, the one that sings Allah Made Everything, and how he incorporates dialogue and musical to tell a story. And so that's what students will be taking part in. Another example that's mentioned in the book is it's a unit of work called Fajr Birds. And I remember once an imam mentioning how each country have their own Fajr Birds. And so I looked into, and I was very much inspired by a scholar named Dr. Dawood Batchelor from Queensland, and his reflections on Fajr Birds, very spiritual. So we've tied in music and listening and all these key components to music and drama into lessons where students look into the hadith on birds and even the verse on how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that glorify your Lord morning and evening, and how we compare it to the Fajr birds and how they do that at Fajr and at Maghrib. And we looked at ways where typical Australian bird calls at dawn and dusk, such as the kookaburra and the cockatoo, if students can capture these sounds and manipulate them during technology and music and align that with the adhan. So basically bringing spirituality into the arts. We find that students get quite engaged with that and connect with that quite well. Another example is another lesson where my students, and again, this was inspired by the DT teacher at Irfan, another class that are looking at purification and wudu, they're going to create a storyboard online, very artistic. And they're very familiar with this platform as well. And so they're going to create a narrative where, because we're looking at the Hanafi jurisprudence, it can be quite dry at times where you're teaching students things like, if a donkey drinks from a bucket of water, then it is doubtful. So it's makruh, but if that's the only water you have, then, you perform your wudu with that, and then you do dry ablution. So if we can get them to create a story, an interesting story, a narrative based on a particular situation that a character faces, such as, this man with his pet donkey, and then create a storyboard with that online, and they're very familiar with this platform, then we're engaging them. And this is something that I proposed to the students this week, and they're quite excited to be a part of. Sorry, what was your second question?
No, the second question is the whole idea that you're able, I said firstly, to connect art to your own beliefs and spirituality, right?
Yeah.
Right. And I want you to ignore my second question, because another question struck me now. And the question I want to ask you is this: one of my criticisms that level against many Muslim schools, many parts of the world, we become purely academic institutions, and as a result, we do not teach art, and the benefits that accrue from teaching art is incredible. And from the beautiful creative ideas you have shown, that will also lead to creative development on the part of the learners. So my thing is, do you not think that art should become a compulsory subject at school in terms of the benefits?
I definitely believe so. And I think Sister Danielle would perhaps have more to say on this, because I am a primary school teacher, so it is compulsory for me and for us to implement. And with primary school teaching, there's a lot more opportunity to intertwine the subjects. Teachers tend to do this naturally because it's the one teacher in the class. And so you're looking at these themes that pop up quite regularly. Whereas this year, alhamdulillah, as a secondary teacher, I've had the opportunity to collaborate with teachers, and that's what I encourage all teachers to do. So when you do have those conversations with, so if I'm teaching Islamic studies and I'm having a conversation with Sister Danielle who's teaching visual arts, then that's, we can immediately collaborate and create these projects where you're simultaneously assessing what you need to assess whilst being creative and whilst the students are quite engaged. But I'll let Sister Danielle answer that a bit more because she does specialize in secondary teaching.
What we'll do is when you come to question time, I'll get Sister Danielle to respond. Thank you so much for a beautiful presentation, and Allah bless you all. Right now, I come to my dear friend, last but not least. He was perhaps biting his nails, Dylan Chow. Dylan is a lecturer for Islamic thought and education, University of South Australia, Australia, down under, my brother, down under, right? So, Dylan, I want to see your beautiful face, Dylan. Then I'll talk to you.
I'm here.
Right. Dylan, you know, I must tell you, I like all the other chapters, I enjoyed reading it, and I could see your heart in it in terms of your experience as a teacher, a strength-based approach to religion and spirituality for Muslim learners in health and physical education. Now, I know it's dear to you, it's close to your heart, and when you speak about the spiritual dimension to health and physical well-being, what is it that inspires you to write about this? What is it that you feel perhaps can benefit schools that also focus on that aspect of the curriculum?
Jazakallah, and it's so good to see you, Brother Idris. You filled my cup up, just your face.
I'll pay you, don't worry.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you for the opportunity and a beautiful question. I think, and as I mentioned in the book, I think the book covers perhaps my journey into Islamic schooling. I had a short journey. I'd only been in the faith a couple of years, although I'd been teaching previously as a health and physical education and sport teacher. So when I came to an Islamic school, it was understanding the importance of the learning area, the curriculum area, but also the co-curricular area. We probably are familiar with quote unquote European or English type schools where sport is a form of social capital. Top private schools tend to, rate sport very highly, and it's a big part of the graduates that leave those schools. So when I came to an Islamic school, I was the first health and physical education teacher. So I had a blank page. In terms of the religion and spirituality, what I think that's something that's really fundamental for HBE teachers. When we're thinking about, I guess it's a bit of a metaphor too, when we're thinking about performance, physical performance, what we're looking to do is prepare students and to develop them in order that they can perform in authentic performance environments. So if you take that as a metaphor for preparing someone for volleyball, how to do well at volleyball in an authentic performance environment, i.e. when a spike or a serve or something is coming at you. Now to take that for a broader metaphor, that my students' experiences, and I think this would translate in many contexts, in many times the main reason or the main way, the main vehicle for leaving the Islamic school and entering into the larger world was through inter-school sport. So HB in sport provided that sort of authentic environment for students who, in the course of learning in that area, as well as their overarching school experience, through a knowledge of who they are, they're able to engage the other, which is a fundamental message, of course, in the Quran. So the other thing is that that's just sport. But if you look at health and physical education, and I had a hard time in the early days, HBE was seen, and I know a few of my colleagues here will resonate this, it was seen as one of the soft humanities subjects, so a subject to do on the side, or if we can squeeze it in across a week. It wasn't seen as a key learning area. So I used to say, well, hang on a minute, after Iman, the greatest gift is health. So surely after Islamic studies, health and physical education is the next most important subject. So that was I stopped doing that, of course, because it's not good to pit other forms of knowledge or other disciplines against one another. But I spent a large amount of time promoting the subject area. I feel that in Islamic schools, sometimes we don't necessarily see those connections faith. I mean, and ironically, as I mentioned in the book, body, mind, and soul is absolutely fundamental to the learning area of health and physical education, as it is to an Islamic philosophy of education and its focus on the whole child. So it's just a learning area that's just perfectly situated for the broader aims, I think, of Islamic education.
You know, the other aspect, you know, is the fact that whenever I've been to Muslim schools, both as a incumbent principal or there's a principal or head teacher, and when I engage, especially our daughters and the girls, and their abiding concern was the fact that they're not given opportunities like the boys, as it were, in terms of sports and everything else that goes with it. Absolutely. And I think, you know, this patriarchal attitude has to change, especially with the dynamics that are going around. You find that our daughters, I use the word advisedly, feel very marginalized. To what extent, you know, in terms of your own participation, did you find that when you got involved with this, when the girls participated in, especially physical education, they felt a sense of affirmation, it enhanced the self-esteem and so on?
It's so true. Look, it was some time ago, but when I entered the Islamic school, the fact was that there weren't any specialist health and PE teachers. So literally the boys were given a soccer ball and they were told to go to the top oval, and the alpha boys essentially kicked goals while the non-alpha boys collected the ball and brought it back to them. And the girls were asked to stand underneath the tree in the shade because it was assumed that they wouldn't want to participate in sport and HPE. And I was just flabbergasted by this. I think that's one of the drivers for the name of the chapter, which is a strength-based approach. I think often, and it shows up sometimes in areas of gender, but often I think I've heard you say this, sometimes there's an orientation towards finding a problem for every solution. So the girl's participation and active engagement sometimes gets put, you know, in the too hard basket. So I sort of challenged us to rephrase our questions. So the common sentiment when I entered the school was, well, we can't do a swimming carnival because, you know, we can't have a mixed swimming carnival and the girls can't, you know, the obvious modesty reasons. So I posed the question, well, how can we have a swimming carnival? So how can we do it differently? One example, you know, we finished, we changed the structure of the school day. We finished early. We hired a public pool. It was an indoor pool, but it was glass all around the outside. So I think we used the, you know, the black sort of material that you put at the bottom of a sandpit or soil. And we literally duct taped that all around the windows. So it was completely uncovered. And we had a boys and a girls separate carnival. And I think I gave a metaphor within there that we did the Iron Woman and the Iron Man. And if you're in Australia, you understand the outdoors culture, which I know my South African brothers and sisters also embrace. And South Africa is a very sporting country. But I wanted them to have the same experience. And we're not always doing the same things, because doing the same things isn't always just or fair. But I wanted the girls to have that opportunity. So we did an Iron Woman, and they would jump in the pool. It was an all-girls event run by female staff and mothers and aunties and sisters and total female crew with the girls participating. They would swim a lap, 50-metre lap. They would put on sporting attire, which was in a bucket at the end of the lane. They would enter the car park and run 800 metres, re-enter the pool, remove the outer clothing and complete the 50-metre lap. And that was the Iron Woman. And that was one of the most powerful events. And Brother Idris, if I can be honest, it's almost a corny thing to do. But the intentionality behind it, the nia behind it, was that I wanted to plant the implicit message that girls, like boys, can be faithful and functional. And we can look creatively at finding ways that allow us to engage in the full gamut so that we're developing all of our domains, the physical being intimately connected to the spiritual and as well the intellectual. So that was just some examples. We modified uniforms. We imported hijab. I know hijabs are readily available, and thanks to Nike and others now. But you know, at that time there were none. Everything was cotton. When it got sweaty, it would shift. And I think our soccer, some of our touch football girls had a football on one arm and holding the hijab on the other. And so we really, those were the early days. But we were able to develop uniforms. The learning area, the curriculum focus. You know, it sounds so simple, and this sort of dovetails something I heard Professor Abdullah say, mashallah, that you engage learners as the active designers and collaborators of their own, in this case, HBE sporting experience.
Okay. Dylan, just 2 points quickly, right? The one is that I noticed in one of the photographs that you have a halakha program with the students when you as a teacher. How effective was that methodology in developing a rapport with the learners, and to what extent also the authenticity of that experience, you know?
So SubhanAllah, it was, you know, it was something that the students, and I know I've got other colleagues here that have done, Sister Samah and Danielle, I understand, have done some amazing work with halakha, as have many others. I would say in HBE, relating and relationship, muamalat, are key. And as we've heard from a number of speakers tonight, the Prophet ﷺ, the nature of his relationships facilitated the growth, growth developmentally, growth intellectually, and growth potentially in taqwa. We wanted, part of this is understanding the alignment of the message systems of schooling. So this is a book on curriculum, but we understand that curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment are intimately connected. So once we were able to, and similar to I really enjoyed listening to Danielle talk about the aims and intentions that she was able to juxtapose and map across different priorities. And in a sense, we did the same thing with HBE. Now, once you've established that, then you set up assessment tasks that are for learning as well as of learning. And then that reconfigures and realigns the purpose of your pedagogy. So we discovered that we needed, for issues like bullying, sexuality, identity, you must have a dialogical approach. There's no way around it. You know, a dialogical approach is necessary. And for us, halakha, I must say as a teacher, it's not as simple as just sitting in a circle. Actually, there's fairly sophisticated pedagogical skills to do halakha well, and that takes time and experimentation and confidence to do so. Scaffolding, patience, and even development with learners. I would say across my 2-year journey with, say, senior students, by the end, I've probably got a backseat in a lot of those halakas. I play a guiding role, but the students themselves are able to self-regulate and almost, and you know, it really shifts. Sometimes it shifts even to like in project-based work, it shifts into being more like a mashura than a halakha. So, you know, really we saw the value of it. I think sexuality education and identity were the 2 topics that I think we saw the most benefit from the halakha, where, you know, students, and again, Professor Abdullah has written a few things specifically in relation to Islamic studies around voice, but, you know, co-design, co-envisioning, student voice. These were sort of fundamental, I guess, tenets of my approach in HBE, and also the approach to renewal that's presented in the chapter.
Okay, you know, I can go on asking everyone more questions, but I want to stop you. Dylan, always a joy to listen to you. And it's quite evident that you do not make excuses. You are solution driven. The effort that you have made to really inspire learners through your subject discipline is really worthy of the highest emulation. Yes, my beloved brothers and sisters, that was generally what you've seen here is only the tip of the iceberg. And I would recommend that you read the text, understand it, and be inspired by it. And what we're going to do is we would like you to raise your hands. We have that option here. To have the raise the hands to ask questions, please. I'm sure there are many questions you want to ask, so we have given you the opportunity. Anybody? Or if you want, you could type out your question. Hello, are you there? Are you so inspired you're writing a new book yourself?
Idris,
Really?
I raised my hand there. I don't know whether you saw me.
I didn't
You're not
see you. I
looking
didn't see.
properly,
Okay, now I seen it. Yeah.
Yuzak.
Okay, you can ask. Continue.
Just a question to Brother Dylan. Regarding the sports and obviously giving opportunities to our female learners. I mean, what about when we find, for example, we have an all boys sport, for example, a soccer tournament, and then the moms want to come for this tournament to watch their sons play. How do you all in Australia work around something like that? Because we've got certain issues, we try and, come to some sort of equality or whatever you may call it, but I believe that that's some of our challenges we're facing here. Jazakallah.
Jazakallah. And look, I noticed that having visited South Africa, I think a feature that I observed was probably far more stricter segregation. I think in Australia there is a separation and it's purposeful. So Islamic schools, and the reality is that graduates are going to leave an Islamic school and enter a society that is diverse, that is mixed, that have different, different worldviews. So when we would segregate, in this, there's much diversity in Islamic schools in Australia as well. But if I speak about the Islamic school that I was in, we saw, the very next step is university, where there is no segregation, no separation. So our philosophy was that when there's, in the interest of haya or suitability or for purposeful reasons, there was separation. For example, if you're teaching sexuality education, the genders should be separate. If students are performing particular sporting activities that are going to be immodest, and one thing I really did push, I want to say, is that I have to say, when I entered, it was as if haya was only for women. So there was zero emphasis. So when I entered, boys had shorts well above the knee. We would go to the swimming pool, and after the pool, the boys would take their shirts off and have a shower in the outside area of a pool. Things like this, and I just found that unacceptable. We redesigned uniforms so that the idea of modesty, though different, was nurtured, modelled, and advanced for men and for boys and girls. Now, in terms of classrooms, we felt that a study we saw overseas was that Muslim girls suffer, unwanted attention, sexual harassment, and even violence in certain university environments. And there's been studies done here in Australia. It's quite shocking, really, and sad. And what they found, they thought initially that the Muslim girls, it must be because they were a minority, that they are few. But when they did studies, they found, no, there are many Muslim students enrolled in these universities and many men. But they found that the Muslim men didn't essentially, and we probably, as Muslims, we know why, but essentially they had no contact with the Muslim women out of, modesty and out of religious and cultural reverence and so on and so forth. However, they would actively engage appropriately, I'm suggesting inappropriately, with non-Muslim women. And therefore, the Muslim women were sort of ostracized within the university environment. So one of the things we pushed in our high school was the idea of being, when there is engagement, there needs to be supervision, because there's an obvious textual reference. You don't meet in isolation. But in the course of the classroom, if it's purposeful, so you're not there to talk about hopes and dreams, favorite colors, these sorts of things. You're there to talk about learning or a project or a common good. It should be time specific, and it should be public. So it was sort of PPI, I think we called it. In terms of sport, which I think is more directly to your question, when sport was arranged in our environment, i.e. in the school, where we are the host, we are then those parameters were probably more adhered to. when we were involved in broader competitions, we had to adapt. For example, we had our own tent. We probably don't have as much access to halal food as you do in South Africa. So we had our own eskies. We actually put up a tent within the tent so that girls had a change room and a place to sit and recover between games to potentially, no one knows because they were in the tent, but to remove hijab, to remove layers of clothing. It is 30 degrees after all, and to prepare for the next game without compromising modesty. But in certain sports were done in total isolation, like gymnastics, like sports aerobics, where the nature of the body movements just don't allow any spectatorship. But other sports, provided that uniform requirements were met, hijab was met, then in the Australian context, there is a mixed audience observing potentially. I hope that helps. I know that's not going to necessarily help the South African context.
Okay. No, Jazakumullah for that. There are a few other questions here. I'm going to call upon Professor Muhammad Abdullah. Firstly, the one is, how do we create love in learners for Islamic studies? Unfortunately, academic studies takes preference in South Africa.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. About love for Islamic studies, we did ask this question for the learners for primary and secondary across maybe 200 students. And interestingly, but not surprisingly, all of them said they love to study Islam and they love Islam itself. And so, and therefore, the problem is not with the learner. It was assumed previously by various people and platforms that the problem is with the learner in the Islamic studies classroom, that he or she are not interested. But that is we got the opposite response from the learners, that they love the study of Islam. So if the learner loves the study of Islam, the question is, at what point do we lose them? At what point do they lose interest in the study of Islam, in this case, Islamic studies, which is the term Islamic studies, I think, is problematic in the Islamic schooling context, and we need to challenge that. So what we have found is that at primary level, usually the problems are not as acute as they are in secondary level in as far as the teaching of Islam. And that is for obvious reasons. And that is not to say we must not focus also our attention on the redesigning and re-examination of Islam, the teaching of Islam at the primary level. I think we need to do that. But what we have found is that when the learner, and this is interesting, whether it's in Islamic schooling context or in the madrasa context, madrasa in this case, I'm not talking about Dar al-Ulum, I'm talking about the madrasa, those that are attached to the masjid and so forth. When the student or the learner becomes about 13 years old, 12, 13, 14 years old, this is when they lose interest in the Islamic studies. And it's not so much, I think, the love that we need to work on, but it's how do we connect with them so that the content of the knowledge that we are presenting is, as I said earlier, is responsive to their needs. So in order to therefore connect these learners with Islamic studies or the teaching of Islam, there are three large things that need to be done. First, examine the content. What are we teaching them? And is what we are teaching them relevant to their age and to their level? Now, in trying to examining what we are teaching them, I don't think it's wise necessarily to assume we know what they want, but we should co-design it with them, as Dylan has mentioned earlier. Just as he has co-designed health HPE, we need to co-design the teaching of Islam with our learners and ask them, what is it that you want to learn? So I did this exercise recently in Adelaide, in South Australia, with young Muslims aged 10 to 14. And when I went into the class, I said, look, I'm not here to lecture you. I don't have any topics in mind. You tell me what is it that you want to learn. And surprisingly, none of them mentioned anything about wudu or salah and so forth. But they wanted to know things such as who created Allah Azza wa Jal? right? Now, how do you answer that? And these are 10 to 14-year-old, and they're asking these very sophisticated metaphysical questions. So this is how they see it's relevant and exciting. Who created Allah? Explain that to me. If Allah Ta'ala controls everything, why doesn't he control shaitan, right? These are tough questions. Why there is so much hate against Islam, and when did that begin, right? And so on. And so when we address those questions, the engagement is phenomenal. So one, therefore, is the content, but that's not enough. Secondly, I think it's the approach or the pedagogy or the way of delivery. And this is where we mustn't be frightened of upskilling ourselves in the way we deliver. Knowing one thing is necessary, but not sufficient. How to present it and engage with the learner is also important. So that's number two. So one is content. We need to examine and re-examine the content in ways that are responsive to the learner and by co-designing those courses with them. Secondly, how do we present it? Even the orientation of the classroom itself makes a difference. The ambience of the classroom. Allow me to say, and I don't, this is not criticism for the sake of criticism. This is criticism because in Islam, we're asked to do muhasaba, introspection. And so I can be frank with you and say, in all the Islamic schools that I went to, in the Islamic studies classrooms, the ambience was so flattening. You walk into these classrooms and you just don't want to learn anything. Forget Islam. There is no ambience, there is no environment, there is no care in those classrooms. And so the student walks in and we're not providing them with the structure, with the ambience, with the setup that allows for that facilitation of learning and not the imposition of learning. And so that's to do with pedagogy. And thirdly, and perhaps this responds to the next question at the same time about separating of knowledge in Islamic schools. I think one of the biggest disasters in Islamic schools, and in fact in the Islamic world, perhaps from I would dare argue from about the 1800s onwards, and as a consequent result of colonization, and that is creating a dichotomy of knowledges in Islam, calling it the secular and the sacred. And that is such a disservice to Islam and so dishonest to the Islamic history, because we've never called knowledge sacred and secular. We called knowledge, and the wisdom of the great ulama of the past was to divide knowledge into fard ayn, individually compulsory, fard kifaya, communal obligation, ilm nafi', beneficial knowledge, and ilm dar, and knowledge that is not useful. And so in a sense, knowledge for us is one big circle. And the intention for which we acquire it and how we apply it makes it useful or otherwise. And so if you walk into the classroom, maths classroom, and you ask the students, and which I have done before, and if I was asked to ask you this question, is mathematics sacred or secular from an Islamic worldview perspective? And if you were to say to me it's secular, I'll say wrong. And if you say it's sacred, I will say you're wrong also, right? Because it's neutral. It's the intention for which we acquire it, because it's so fundamental. And how do we apply it? And so what has happened in Islamic schools? We have, and this has led to this disservice to Islamic studies. And now I'm speaking to the leaders of Islamic schools. And that is, when we have created this dichotomy where Islamic studies sits on its own and everything else sits on its own, add to this the fact that most of the investment is on those other subjects and the least investment often is in Islamic studies. The children or the learners actually see that, they perceive that. And this is interesting, and sorry, Brother Idris, for the long answer, but when we ask those young learners in various, and Dylan and I, we were in one of these focus groups with primary, they were about 10, 11 years old, and I recall walking in wondering, what are they going to tell us? And it was the most dynamic, engaging focus group that we've had. And what was interesting about all these students, they said one thing. They said, we know this. We know that the school calls itself Islamic, but it's not really Islamic. And we wanted to find out why they're saying that. They said, well, the Islamic is not enacted, or it's only confined to the Islamic studies classrooms. Now, this is grade 10, year 10 and 11. age 10 and 11. So therefore, there are three levels. If we are to help this learner attach or react positively, if you like, and not love. I think they love it, but we haven't been able to present it in the way that can attract them to it. And I think school leadership need to change their perceptions of Islamic studies and try to infuse the teaching of Islam across the school and not confine it to 2 classes per week in Islamic studies. I know it's a tall order, but it's something that has to be done. Wallahu a'lam.
Jazakumullah for that. Let's look at the other questions here. Right. The one is, okay, Professor Abdullah, others can also free to answer that. What should be the best approach to convince parents that Islamic studies needs curriculum revival renewal, and thus believing on the old syllabus does not 100% suit the current Muslim learners in Muslim schools, right? Then I'll also go to this question. Part 1 of the book deals with the Quran, Sirah, and Akhlaq, among other topics. Can one of the editors provide a brief overview of these chapters? Okay.
Yeah, I think both somewhat relate to you, but I'd love also Dylan and Samah and Danielle to also jump in, talking about the parents, because I think when we speak about it's not only Islamic studies that is the problem when it comes to engaging parents. I think, well, the schools that we have engaged with, there is perhaps a failure to engage with parents. And parents have, in my humble viewpoint, and from what I have seen and heard from parents, is that they don't feel a sense of ownership, right? And it's not about convincing the parents, it's about winning the parents over and trying to make them believe that it's ownership, right? And so we have, Dylan and I and my team have often said, for example, to Islamic schools, when you want to renew your vision, just as an example, the vision of the Islamic school, don't do it by yourself, but include all stakeholders. Bring the teachers and the students and the parents, and involve everybody in the process of the renewal so they believe and see the value of that. Once parents see that they are valued for their opinion and not for their, for their money or otherwise, but for their viewpoint, and we are able to intelligently engage them, then they will see the value of the renewal. And allow me to say also, nuance here is important. Words and lexicology is important. I think we should focus on renewal, not revival. Revival gives the indication that something is dead and it needs to be revived. And I don't think Islamic schools or Islamic education are dead. I think they've contributed tremendously and continue to do so. But what we are arguing in this book and elsewhere is that Islamic schools have now passed the establishment phase. And now they need to renew that which is beautiful by examining and re-examining it so that it can be reflective of the needs of the day for the learners. Allahu A'lam. And please, Dylan or anybody would like to jump in.
Not sure if Danielle or Samar, but I was going to just extend on the point about vision.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the point that was made, we talk about the pedagogy in the classroom, but when we see, I think if we look at the phases of Islamic schooling in Australia, and I'm sharing this so that my South African colleagues can reflect on where they're at, but we had an establishment phase from 1983 through to the 90s. And schools were small. There was tight relationships between those early parent supporters and the school. Then schools expanded. We had a huge policy, favourable policy, where government paid for buildings and all sorts of things. And Islamic schools in the belonging phase from around the 1990s to the 2000s became institutions, which was problematic because when a school community becomes an institution, it starts to become administrative and managerial. And we started to see one-way communication with parents. And then when there's only one-way communication with parents, the only option that parents have is the protest voice. So they don't actually have any channels to be engaged in the school except to I guess, be disrupted through protest. We're entering now through this process of renewal where we, Bismillah, collectively as a schooling community in Australia, we're entering this stage of distinction, where we're not competing against other Islamic schools. We're not trying to outdo whatever other leading schools, but we're searching for a distinct Islamic faithful form of education. And by Professor Abdullah was mentioning about the collaborative nature of co-envisioning and developing a vision together. When that's done, and when you bring the parents and friends, because there are always friends to the school community, when you bring them with you on that journey, you have the ability to sort of, to present alternatives. I think would be a key factor. And educators being involved in that vision mean that it translates into classroom practices. Because if they're disengaged from it, then whatever the vision is and whatever the practices are usually don't align. So I think having more dialogue and developing channels, which only comes through relationships. I would say in the belonging phase in Australia, there was tensions. Islamic schools saw parents as potentially disruptive and kept them at bay. And parents learnt like a 2-year-old child that if they scream and they learn they get a response. And that was a negative sort of type of relationship, which we've moved out of.
Okay, what you want to do, we'll take this last question from Ismail Chunara, then I'll make my concluding statement, inshallah. Ismail Chunara, your question?
Firstly, I'm sorry, I was trying to get into the program. I got in late. However, I missed the initial part of the discussion. But I would like to say that if we're discussing, at the moment, we're discussing parents and their participation in the program. But when I'm going to discuss the participation of teachers and pupils, is that still coming on?
No, that's not the purpose. This is the launch of the book, Curriculum Renewal for Islamic Education. And naturally, they are perhaps teachers listening in. Teachers also contributed to this book. And I like to believe head teachers, when they engage the teachers, they'll would get the teachers to contribute to what has happened. And inshallah, also look at creative solutions to the ongoing dynamics in the curriculum. All right, Jazakumullah.
Yeah, the question is, with the initial discussion on Islamization on all subjects. Now, is this book covering all subjects, biology and etc., maths, geography, or is it only one particular aspect?
No. I would recommend, inshallah, that you get a copy of this book, and it will inspire you. It will inspire you to reflect on all of those things, inshallah. Okay.
So, where can I get the book?
Okay, you can contact me privately. We'll talk, inshallah.
Lovely. Inshallah, we'll do.
Right, Assalamu alaikum. Right. Anyway, I want to say in conclusion, Jazakumullah to Nadeem Memon, to Professor Muhammad Abdullah, Dylan Chown, Daniel, and Sama for an excellent presentation, an excellent overview of the book, and having also discussed some of the issues. And I want to thank the Association of Muslim Schools for coordinating this. And Alhamdulillah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I always enjoy this presentation. And inshallah, I like to believe, psychologists have said, if you do not change within 48 after a presentation, it's unlikely you're going to change. And I think I really like to believe that enough has been mentioned. It has been insightful. And perhaps it forces you or goads you on to reflect on your own craft, because the ummah, as I always say, is bleeding. And what it requires dynamic head teachers, dynamic teachers, of course, dynamic students and parents. They want education that is relevant, that is inspirational. Students do not want to be any more passive receptacles of knowledge. So with those few words, to all of you, and it's so good to see my beloved brothers and sisters from Australia. Alhamdulillah. I feel I haven't been traveling. eating humble pie at home, but Alhamdulillah, I'm pining to travel out there. Jazakumullah. May Allah bless you all, your presenters. May you continue to inspire all of us. Shukran. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Wa alaikum assalam. Wa alaikum
Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair.
Hey, people.